Southampton town historian, and he also works with Sag Harbor as a cultural, a historic advisor. He just wanted to make sure that he was able to interject into the symposium the fact that the cemetery, the Southampton burying ground on Little Plains Road in Southampton Village, the story behind it is that it's a really early cemetery dated in 1650. And it filled up so quickly that it closed in 1710. He believes that many of the stones that were there for wealthy people, that they would have been stones that would have been brought over from Connecticut, which would have been brownstone, and also from New England, which would have been slate. And it would have been very costly to have these stones shipped, so there weren't many stones there, although they have knowledge that the burying ground was filled. So undoubtedly, some of the markings and the burials of the plots of African American slaves and servants were either unmarked or simply marked with a field stone. And over the years, the field stone lost their significance as well. And other cemeteries, they make notice of this in Sagaponack and also Kachog. So after a few of the following buries and memories fade away, so does many of the markers, and they also opted for wooden markers, which also fade away. So he also wants to let you guys know that virtually everyone who settled in the town of Southampton, either willingly or unwillingly, was entitled to a burial because the burial ground was a municipal burial ground and not from the church. So thus, everyone who passed through the earlier decades would have been buried at this site. And he also really interjects, which is really important, is the fact that this is an example of African Americans in colonial America, so that's really important. And he had some photos that were showing us many of the stones. So here's one of some of the stones, shows you that the burying ground closed in 1710, but where are many of the stones? So they have disappeared over time. So now we can pass it back to Carl for discussion.
Have a little discussion among the panelists. I'll throw a few questions, and then we'd like to open it to the audience to ask questions too of the panelists. Sandra, if I can just throw a question at you first. What does it take to create a database, and who's using that database?
Wow. Well, it takes the public to create the database. What we're doing, when I say we, myself and my advisory committee, is we're creating an actual process of documentation. And part of the process is finding a way, number one, to have a verification process, for the sites, but also a public outreach initiative or campaign is very important, because it's impossible to document the sites or get information on the sites into the future database without the public letting us know where they are. So that's good.
What about funding? Who is providing the bucks for this initiative?
Well, the database, the work, when I started the work, I was actually a non-traditional student at Fordham University, and meaning I was just an adult student. They call it non-traditional. But I started the work there, and shortly after I started the work there, I received a wonderful contribution from the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was a chairman's award, a chairman's grant, and that's something you don't necessarily apply for. It's a recognition from the National Endowment for the Humanities that this is work that they feel needs to be funded, and work that is substantial to the humanities. So the seed funding that we've received thus far has come from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Secondly, I think, obviously foundations that focus on historic preservation, it's not Sylvester Manor, I'm sorry. The 1772 Foundation, which is a foundation that focuses a lot on historic preservation, but unfortunately they fund typically brick and mortar preservation, but they have been very supportive of our work and have given funds for us to be able to hire fellows and interns and things like that. So So I guess to answer your question though, really, really specifically, we're still raising funds to create the database, but we have received some really great seed funding that's, it's very encouraging.
Just a question to Zach. How do you find lost graves? I mean, in the case of Sylvester Manor, Dr. Steve explained, here we looked at Sylvester Manor, but for you, to find graves scattered around East Hampton must be a very daunting process.
It wasn't something that was, say, my conscience to think about until actually fairly recently. It wasn't really, we were dealing with our own lists and going back to places that we believe, but now that I've been seeing the recent documents that have been coming in, you recognize that we only have 2 known graves of slaves, and we're missing, if not multiple dozens, and maybe even into the hundreds. But it's also started to get me to think about that. So I haven't done it yet, but I definitely want to find out more about this. I don't know if it's a sonar system that they use to inspect the ground or not, but I've begun thinking about this, and I've noticed, so we have places that I'll have like one grave, and like Thomas Jefferson Davis, that cemetery is 20-something feet wide and like 44 feet long, and there's only one headstone in it. Now, that makes me start wondering why. And there are a bunch of rocks in there, and now, I didn't know about this until about a week ago. I always thought he was African American. I found another document that he was mulatto. Mulatto means he could have been mixed with, and they think maybe he was mixed with Indian blood. Indians, when they buried, often just put a rock on the ground. So there is a sense, I guess, of playing detective and starting to look for clues and going into records and saying what's out of place here, what's unusual, and then maybe going the next step. The Long Island collection is a great boon, and actually one of the things that Sandra and I were talking about is that 20 years ago you might have scanned documents in made PDFs, but they weren't searchable. Now you can go in and you can scan in hundreds and hundreds of pages of old documents, but then you can put them on a program and search for words, and you might find clues. So if we continue on this, that's the direction I go.
Georgia, I wondered, the major cemetery in Sag Harbor is the Oakland Cemetery. As you drive into East Hampton, there's the cemetery where Lyon Gardner is buried. What's the deal with these